Recording is in progress. So, yeah, on our YouTube channel, you can see recordings of some of our past events. These are some of the ones that we've held very recently. You can check those out. If you're interested in volunteering with us, we're always looking for people to help us out. You can write recaps of our presentations. You can be an ambassador on social media. And there's lots of other ways to get involved as well. If that's something you're interested in, you can go ahead and reach out to us at the email below, sdn.newyorkchapter@gmail.com, and we can start a conversation. We'd love to have you join us. You can also join us on a more corporate level through sponsorship. If your company that you work for is interested in getting involved in giving us a place to host in-person events, help us with Zoom subscriptions or Meetup subscriptions, anything like that, we welcome all kinds of help, whatever we can get. And as well, if you are interested in speaking at one of our events, we'd love to hear from you. Again, you can reach out to us at sdn.newyorkchapter@gmail.com. Barry, I'm going to impose upon you, spur of the moment, and talk about the donate button that you just added to the Meetup page.
Oh, all right. Thanks, David. So recently, Meetup just integrated a little button that says pledge. And we like to keep these events low. I think that it really allows to build a community at a very low expense to everyone. The initial dollar is just for accountability. But if you really like what we're doing and you want to participate, you want to maybe give a little back, we would love it. It helps cover our Zoom fees, helps cover just some of the basic administration. Of course, we're non-for-profit. So the donate button now is open, and we are so grateful for anyone. Everything helps. And we love our community, and thank you so much for helping us continue this and for expanding our community. So thank you.
Yeah. And now, without further ado, I am going to go ahead and introduce our speaker for the evening. Our speaker is Victor Udoewa. Udoewa. Did I get that right, Victor? Udoewa.
Yeah, you got it.
Okay, great, thank you. Victor is the Chief Experience Officer and Service Design Lead in the NASA Small Business Innovation Research and Small Business Technology Transfer Program. I hope you don't have to say that name on a regular basis. Prior to NASA, he was the Director of Strategy at 18F, a civic consultancy for the federal government inside the federal government. He helped to start the education business unit, developed a line of educational products and services, directed strategy, managed the group of digital strategists and the digital strategy practice, and served as a designer and strategist on partner projects. Previously, as a global education instructional designer and training development specialist at Google, he designed learning experiences and learning software for people in the low to middle income countries around the world. This education could range from experiences covering how to develop web applications and how to use the internet to improve teaching and learning, to experiences exploring how to use internet technologies in a post-disaster emergency response situation, as well as global digital literacy. And as part of that work, he also advised Google in global energy and access work. Prior to that, he worked for USAID and DHS, and his resume goes on and on. He is, aside from that, sings in a male a cappella group, which is awesome. And he teaches salsa, which is even more awesome. And I will, without any more of my noise, turn it over to Victor.
Thanks. The male a cappella group and the salsa haven't restarted since COVID happened, so I'm hoping that comes back soon. Can you enable share for me? It's not allowing me to do so.
Somebody vamp while I'm getting this done.
So, Victor, tell us, what's space like?
Um, it's pretty empty.
You're good to go, Victor.
Okay.
All right, you heard it here. Space is empty. Thanks.
All right. So I won't be looking at the chat, but we can talk afterwards. Assuming you can see my screen. So we will get started. You people always come here for the same thing, asking me the same questions, and I never see a single change in my community. These were the words that greeted me upon entering a particular community in North Central India for a design research project. And what that gentleman was letting me know was that he had, in his community, experienced history of extractivist, transactionalist design and research that had never truly improved or benefited his community in any way, nor involved their true direction, voice, or vision in the work. So when I entered that community, I carried that history. I was one of those people. And it begs a question for all of us, really, as designers: how do we do this work in ways that are just? So, welcome. My name is Victor Udoewa. I'm designer. You heard the intro. I am both US American and Nigerian. I come from the African indigenous tribe Ibibio. My middle name, Anyete, stands for, it's a shortened version of the phrase, who is like God. Whenever I speak or talk from any type of indigenous perspective, usually I'm coming from a more African indigenous perspective, which the indigeneity is slightly, there are some differences between indigeneity in the Americas or in Australia. And specifically, I live in Washington, D.C., although I'm not there at the moment. And where my house is located was originally the land of the Naco-Chunk. They, due to persecution, actually moved to a small, tiny island, Theodore Roosevelt Island, in the Potomac River. And due to further persecution, they joined a neighboring tribe in Maryland. We're right on the border of Maryland, the Piscataway, and they moved eventually up to Pennsylvania. Now, the Naco-Chunk were a people group before the colonists arrived, when the colonists were here, and still today. And I just want to honor them and acknowledge the land on which I move and breathe and have my being. Now, land acknowledgements don't change a single thing about the allocation of resources or power or money or land. But what they do is work at the mythological level. Remember, with mythologies, it doesn't matter if a mythology is true or false in the Enlightenment sense. What matters is if it is living or dead. And there's a mythology around the history of participatory design. So join me as we unhouse, unsettle, unearth the history of participatory design. Join me as we decolonize the history of participatory design. Now, when you ask people, hey, when did Homo sapiens first appear? By the most recent discoveries, we'd say around 300,000 years ago. Okay, well, when did participatory design emerge? Well, I think it emerged in the 1970s in Scandinavia with this movement of collaborative design. Or maybe you might go back to the 1960s. In 1960, Carl Lynn founded the first kind of participatory architecture center, Philadelphia. Or Jane Jacobs wrote this beautiful book, which really critiqued the centralized urban planning model and planted the seeds for a more participatory urban planning model. You could go even further, maybe, to say the 1940s with the participatory action research models out of Europe. But either way, 60s, 70s, 40s, notice that arrow hasn't moved on the right, because most of that time from 300,000 years ago all the way up to the 40s, 60s, 70s of today is empty and void of participatory design. But wait a minute, does that make sense? Well, what if design is just some form or manner or method of gathering or getting information, some form of coming up with an idea and then in some way trying that idea out? Well, if that's the definition of design, I'm willing to bet that we have had many more years of design before the 1940s. Travel with me to the 13th century in West Africa, to the tradition of the griot. The griot was the storyteller, the oral historian, the social memory of a people group, and dealt with, it was a community's response or design to the challenge of remembering and history. The griot used fables and folk tales and proverbs and instruments and songs and epic narratives in order to embed that history, not only in the mind of the griot, but in the mind of the hearers. Because we all know the power of story in the human psyche, so powerful that even today there are professional futurists, professional designers who use storytelling as a serious methodology. We could go to ancient Mesopotamia, where as civilizations were growing and growing, they were trying to figure out, how do we grow enough food for all these people? Well, the community got together and they began to build large storage basins to hold the water, because the problem was, when it rained too much, the fields were flooded and the crops ruined. And if it didn't rain enough, the crops didn't grow enough. Well, they built these storage basins to store water, and then built these canals, right, in order to divert the water to the farmland when there wasn't enough rainfall. And they built up the riverbanks to deal with when the flooding was high. And this was a community response to a community problem. And that design began to evolve, and canals then began to become institutionalized around the world. We could travel to India, although this is true in many other countries, in which you had to deal with the challenge of the conservation and use of medicinal plant knowledge. They came up with 3 different designs that I know of: traditional systems of medicine, TSMs, in which you encoded or embedded medicinal plant knowledge in ancient scriptures and texts. The second was folk medicine, in which you learned by doing it and passed that knowledge on through oral tradition. And the third was the expert approach, in which you embedded or embodied that medicinal plant knowledge in a spiritualistic or shamanistic person that we might call a healer, who then passed that on through apprenticeships. But even around 3,000 years ago, when you're thinking of the Ayurvedic or the Siddha tradition, of the traditional system of medicine, those systems of medicines were just codifying folk medicine, which people had been practicing for thousands of years before that. So when we look back at this timeline, wait a minute. Participatory design has been happening throughout history. In fact, even before Homo sapiens, when you think of things like other species, Homo habilis, or even think of plants, we know that trees today, or even before, can communicate with themselves through the ground, through mycelia, right? Where they can warn of impending danger and protect each other by sending signals and preparing for things that are to come. These are all types of designs. We could do the same thing with participatory research. We could say, Homo sapiens came around 300,000 years ago, and there are 2 different traditions. In the Southern tradition, participatory research formed in the 70s with Paulo Freire and the beautiful work, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. If you haven't read it, you should. Or you could say in the Northern tradition, again in the 1940s, with those participatory action research models. But what if research is just gathering, creating, sorting, transmitting, using information? Well, if that's the case, then I think participatory research also has been occurring for many, many, many centuries, maybe even thousands of years before the 1940s. Let's go back to 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, even 19th century with the slave trade, specifically the transatlantic slave trade, in which people would raid villages, take these prisoners and march them down to the coast, store them in castles, put them in ships, ship them across the Atlantic to the Americas. And oftentimes before this would happen, either in preparation or when raids were happening and people were being stolen, the women would take seeds, grains, often of rice, and put them in the hair, maybe of the children, of themselves, and braid that hair as a means of conserving a legacy or preserving a way of life or passing down information to their children, or in what we call today participatory appraisal. It's a method of participatory research. When the people would arrive in the Americas and the slaves would look amongst themselves, what do we have here? What assets do we have in order to make a life or to grow something? Because we're definitely not going to be able to eat the master's food. They could then look at what they have and begin to grow some of their own food. We could go to ancient Greece, where the midwives were trying to figure out methods of birth control, and they learned from the animal herders which plants the animals ate, which slowed down their frequency of childbirth, right? And that information was transmitted to those midwives who continued it. We could go even before Homo sapiens, right? 2.6 million years ago, you had people that would take these stones and hit them on the edge of something and create these sharpened stones, which you see on the left. And that evolved to about 1.6 million years ago. We had stone hand axes, which evolved eventually to these knapping tools around 400 to 200,000 years ago. And eventually, you see on the right these cutting blades that came around 80,000 to 40,000 years ago, which still evolved more to like small, sharp microblades 11 to 17,000 years ago. And then eventually in the Neolithic era, we had around 12,000 years ago, axes for the first time and chisels. All of this type of experimentation is a type of research. So when we look at the timeline again, we realize, well, wait a minute, participatory research has been happening throughout communities and even before the emergence of Homo sapiens. In other words, participatory research is ancient. Participatory design is ancient. And one of the reasons I think we don't understand this or realize this is because of the rise of the professional designer, the professional researcher. When we look at what research justice says, it says, look, there are different types of knowledge, not just mainstream institutional knowledge. There's lived experiential knowledge, there's cultural knowledge, spiritual knowledge. And research justice says that all of these types of knowledge are actually equal to each other. Well, wait a minute. If there are other types of knowledge besides the mainstream institutional knowledge that I might read in some written document, in an academic journal article, et cetera, in a textbook, well, then it changes the nature of research, actually changes the definition of research. Research moves from just being investigation to a pluriverse of definitions. Research moves from being an investigation to establish a fact or reach a conclusion to a pluriverse of purposes. So, what is participatory design? It goes by many names. I've seen people call it collaborative design, co-creation, etc. People mean slightly different things, but more or less, it's pretty much the same. Either they mean, one of four things. One, they just mean inclusion. So I'm going to do research and I'm going to ask questions. I'm including these people. I call them participants. So this is participatory design. More usually, though, people might mean one of these other three things, which is a method. I'm going to do a usability test. No, let's do participatory design. Okay. Some people might mean a way of doing a method. So let's do a design studio. Actually, instead of just doing a design studio with professional designers, why don't we invite the community members to be a part of it and do it participatorily? And others mean a methodology. And by methodology, I mean a collection of methods or a set of guiding principles or philosophies that help you to choose a particular method at a particular point in a process. But all of these, no matter if you're talking about inclusion, a method, a way of doing a method, or a methodology, all of these center the designer and use the model of designer as facilitator. They focus on empowerment. But remember this, when we empower others, we're actually reinforcing the hierarchy we seek to subvert. We're choosing who participates, when they participate, why, where, and how they participate. We know that if there's a participatory workshop on Monday and we have another participatory workshop on Wednesday, we know what we're doing on Tuesday, right? We're looking at what happened on Monday. We're trying to see what information from workshop 1 is going to carry over to workshop 2. We're trying to see, do the outcomes of workshop 1 still fall in line with the goal of the workshop series? We're trying to decide if there's any new information that introduced nonlinearity in workshop 1 that changes the direction and sends workshop 2 in a different direction. All of this sense-making, interpretation, evaluation, and decision-making is happening without any of the community members present. As much as we want to neutralize facilitation, we can't, because facilitation is power. Instead, in radical participatory design, we move to 3 different models. Number 1, we move to a model of designer as community member. This means that the designer sits equal to and alongside all of the other community members on this design and or research team. But it also means that the skills of the design and research are equal to and alongside all the other assets, skills, talents, gifts, and abilities of all the other community members. Number two, we move to a model of community member as designer, in which the community member is doing design and or research. And number three, we move to a model of community member as facilitator. Why? Because facilitation is power, and therefore the community should be wielding that power. In all my work, I've induced three different high-level characteristics of radical participatory design. These are not requirements, these are characteristics that I've noticed. Number one, the community members are always present and leading. In fact, that's why we say radical. Radical doesn't mean extreme. Radical comes from the Latin word radix, meaning root, meaning fully, all the way. They are full-fledged members of the design and research team from beginning to end, from top to bottom. There are no meetings, no phone calls that they are not a part of because they are members of the team. Number two, they outnumber the professional designers and professional researchers. And number three, the community members own the outcomes and artifacts as well as the narratives around the outcomes and artifacts. I tend to look at it through three different lenses: who initiates, who participates, and who leads. In community design, it's the community. They're doing the work, they initiate it, they're there and they lead it, it's just them. In community-driven design, regardless of who initiates, the community may involve some architect or some other type of designer to come and look or to give their opinion or to actually implement something, but the community is always leading. Now, what we normally call participatory design, I call colonial participatory design. And this is where, regardless of who initiates, the professional designers may or may not allow the community members to participate, but we never ever reach equitable co-leadership. Rather, I invite us to what I call radical participatory design, in which regardless of who initiates, the community is always present, always participating, and always leading. And they may or may not invite professional designers up to and including equal participation and equitable co-leadership. This challenges the notion of research justice. We want to go beyond that, which says that these three types of knowledge or three buckets of knowledge are equal. No, actually, in radical participatory design, cultural knowledge, spiritual knowledge, lived experiential knowledge, bodied, relational, intuitive, aesthetic knowledge are greater than mainstream institutional knowledge. Well, Victor, slow down. Why are you saying that? Well, let's think about a medical doctor. It's very difficult for a medical doctor to help you with only textbook, medical school, institutional mainstream knowledge without getting any of your lived experiential knowledge of what hurts and where it hurts and when it hurts. However, the way we were built as human beings, we can listen to some of the lived experiential knowledge and it can guide us, not in all cases, but in some cases, to resolve some of our issues. We know sometimes when we're dehydrated, we need to get water, or hungry, we need food, or we're overexerting ourselves. Even if you look at women in childbirth, as they're going through labor, there are positions that they can begin to move their bodies in that feel less painful than others. And we know that those positions tend to be ones that are more conducive for the child and the baby to come through the birth canal. So they're not equal. And radical participatory design elevates that. And in fact, we don't just talk about the voices of the community, we talk about the expertise. If you are an expert, if I'm an expert because of mainstream institutional knowledge, they're an expert with a different kind of knowledge. So what are the benefits though, if we engage in this practice? I want to talk about the benefits through a few different examples. I'll add a few more, but I want to talk about one. It's a digital literacy project, multinational company. We were trying to bring the next billion users online. There was training on, what you might call DevOps today, back then system administrators, training on how to build web apps and mobile apps, but also the biggest one for the biggest amount of people specifically was this digital literacy, how to help people use the internet to do their life and solve problems and do the things that are most important to them. This project failed a number of times. The VP quit, the project lead switched to another project. And so it opened up a space where the company gave up power and didn't care. And I was allowed to begin to try to do this project in a different way. So we're going to focus on the digital literacy component of this. And this is an example of a successful project. I'm going to use a different one for an example of a project that I believe was not successful. There is an international summer service learning program in Washington, D.C. that helps and works with high school students in Washington, D.C. and takes them to foreign countries for the summer to do service learning projects on the ground. And then they come back and do social entrepreneurship projects in Washington, D.C. And we were working on redesigning this curriculum and the program because it was failing the students in a number of different ways. This is an example of one that did not work. And we were doing this work with a nonprofit that runs this program, who also alongside the school district, because the nonprofit works with the school district to get students to do this work. So let's talk a little bit through the benefits to understand. The first is inclusive design is much more possible and more readily embedded when you do radical participatory design. In fact, we move beyond inclusive design and inclusive research, right, to actually having an inclusive team. The community members are embedded on the team. Number two, when they're embedded on the team, actually that affects inclusive research and recruitment. So if you look at this picture, I'm in the far right column. I'm doing a homestay. You can think of it as a participant observation, but over a number of days, while the rest of the team is divided into two, and they're going into two different communities. And guess what? Number one, they don't need translators because they speak the language. And number two, they have connections and lifelong relationships that they can build upon. People recognize them. It reduces anxiety, and they're more likely to participate. Number two, the truly only way you can do human-centered design, in my opinion, the only way you can center, right, the human throughout the design process is to do radical participatory design. For the humans for whom you're designing to be a part of the team the entire way through. And in fact, when you do radical participatory design, I often find this, you go beyond human-centered design because the community wants to move towards society-centered design, community-centered design, life-centered design, and even planet-centered design. So here's an example from a project where we were looking at different needs. And we started off with this sheet. We're looking at plant needs and building needs and compost needs. This is not anthropocentric. I had another project where we were doing a water project nationally, but through multiple local communities. So you can think of it as a trans-local project. And here was the design challenge that they chose. Ensure a safe, sustainable, equitable, and affordable drinking water future. Now, affordable, yes, refers to humans, but not drinking water, not equitable, not sustainable, and not safe. We had a much expansive vision of what it means to do life and really planet-centered design for water. Number three, empathy is an impossibility. Stop chasing it. You won't find it. Some of you are like, wait, what are you talking about? Empathy is really big. I'm not the only person that says this. You can find this actually in the social work literature, where social work, a few people say that empathy is an impossibility due to the inherent power imbalance between the social worker or therapist and the client. We have that same power imbalance as designers, right? And actually, most of the time when we say empathy, we're talking about intellectual empathy, knowing what the people for whom we're designing are going through. We rarely mean emotional empathy, where we begin to feel with and feel alongside those people, although some designers might feel that. But the hardest of all of them to achieve is compassionate empathy, where the emotional empathy then leads you to act and do something. Whoa, wait a minute, Victor. Last week, that project that we did, we actually did do something. We built something, we designed something, yes. But would you have been moved to act? Would you have done something if you were not under a contractual obligation, if you were not being paid to come in as a designer to design something? Well, wait a minute, Victor. Wait, a month ago, we had that pro bono project. We volunteered, we weren't paid. Yes, doesn't have to have money to be contractual. We're still entering into an understanding that we're coming in to design something. We don't know, because of the structure of the relationship, if we would have been moved to do this work apart from it. Lastly, the problem that we make or confuse with this is that we think of these as three different types of empathy. No, these are three different components of empathy. In other words, we need all of them to say that we have empathy, the intellectual, the emotional, and the compassionate coming together. In fact, the difficulty is so great that we don't even bother with it in radical participatory design. We have the team members there. We practice what I call embedded or embodied empathy. So instead of trying to figure out and create personas of people, the team is creating personas of themselves. their own actions and behaviors and thoughts and feelings. Number 4, trauma responsive design is more readily enabled through radical participatory design. I don't want to go too deeply into this, but there are 6 components of a trauma-informed approach, which you can see here from SAMHSA. Now, all of these, I would say, especially think of bringing your histories in number 6, the empowerment, number 5, collaboration, mutuality, the peer support, all of that is a part of radical participatory design, but especially the trustworthiness, transparency, and safety, because the community's experience is there. So when I was doing the digital literacy project, and I say I, but really the community, we were able to do observations, for instance, without re-traumatizing or without triggering people, because we had members of the community on the research and design team who knew what it was like. Number 5, research through design happens much more often, right? Often because communities don't know these design methodologies. They just want to try stuff and see what happens and learn from it. And often as professional designers, we are the ones who introduce the nonlinearity. We say, ooh, okay, this is how that activity went. These were the outcomes. This is our goals. Guess, I think this is what I think we need, because this is missing, or this was the problem, and it doesn't matter what the toolkit says. But the nonlinearity, when you do radical participatory design, comes from the community. And they're more likely to just test things and try things out, as opposed to having that linear approach. So in the digital literacy project, we were trying out a particular app to see its effect and how it worked for digital literacy, not because we were going to learn how to improve the app, but as a throwaway prototype to learn in general. Number 6, systems practice is more automated. It's more embedded when you do radical participatory design. We know from standpoint theory, I'm pulling from academia, which comes from feminist theory. Standpoint theory says that one of the things it says is that people at the bottom of a social hierarchy tend to have a more accurate, if not accurate, holistic picture of the system. And this has been my experience, that people in communities, they tend to be more in tune with these socio-natural and socio-human systems. And so I'm working on a project right now where we're investigating generalized trauma in the rural South. This is based in North Carolina, and we have the system app that was created, and we're at the point right now where we've been analyzing it and finding leverage points, and now beginning to look at ways to affect and influence the system from within the system. Number 7, pluriversal and futures design happens much more readily and much more often when you're doing radical participatory design. What do I mean by pluriversal design? I mean a move away from the damage-centered, problem-based, needs-based, deficit-based design to a more desire-based design. I mean, can we not have a pluralistic vision of the good life? Can we think of the world moving and developing in ways that don't involve putting a McDonald's in every single one of them? In fact, when you do radical participatory design, what I found over and over again is that you often will move towards and begin to do asset-based methodologies. Why? Because communities love to define themselves by what they have, not by what they lack. So you have these students in the International Summer Service Learning Program that are mapping pathways through a potential program, not based on some problem or this or that, but based on who they want to be and where they want to go. So these benefits are great, and it's wonderful if you do it, but you can get all these benefits and try to do radical participatory design and do it unethically. So what are the ethics of radical participatory design? I'm going to mention really 2 lenses of ethics: equality and equity. I'm going to really focus on remuneration. There are many other things we could talk about, and we can talk about it in the Q&A, but right now we know that there's a gender pay gap. There's also a racial pay gap we don't talk as much about. There's an ability pay gap we don't talk as much about. And we know that if a man and a woman, or a man and a non-binary person are doing the same job, they should be paid the same. That's equality. Well, you as a designer and myself as a designer, we're doing the same work as community members on the team. So they should be paid the same as us. However, equity, they're often giving up time away from one job, away from 2 jobs, away from no job, but time they would have spent to find a job. In other words, their time is more valuable than ours because we're just doing our job and getting paid for it, while this is on top of and interfering with their job or their ability to find one. And when the time is more valuable for someone, they should be paid more. We failed with the International Summer Service Learning Program. None of the students were paid. Well, wait a minute, Victor. I know that they weren't paid, but you and the other professional designer, there were two of you, you weren't paid either. You're right. You're right. So we had equality, but that doesn't change the fact that it was wrong not to pay and compensate those students. Furthermore, we did not have equity because the effect, the outcome of not paying those students was not the same as the effect or outcome on not paying the two professional designers. But a lot of people struggle because how do you do this? I don't have the money. Put that aside and just think about creative ways to compensate people. Now, definitely we pay people, but I want to use the Digital Literacy Project as an example of the plethora of ways that people were compensated beyond money. First of all, you see the meal in front of you, right? So that is breakfast and lunch. Every day they received both of those throughout that project. And if we traveled, they received dinner. If we had a special event at night, they received dinner. All their travel expenses, room and board, were paid when we traveled in order to move to other parts in North Central India. If they wanted to be an author, for many of them first-time author on a journal paper, they could be. If they wanted to be a second-time author on a paper, they joined in. Some of them wanted referrals or references or recommendations, which we gave. Every time I came back to the same region in order to test out a new educational product or service, I called them up and contacted them to see if they wanted to be among the first to test these things out. In other words, don't think about the creativity being on your shoulders. It's up to them. It is their desires that drive how you compensate them. But how do you know if your process was truly radically participatory? How do you evaluate that? Now, I'm not talking about evaluating the design outcome, right? Hopefully we have ways and are getting better in ways of doing that, but I'm specifically talking about the process, because if the process is truly radically participatory, you will have other outcomes beyond the design outcomes. One question and one question alone. Have a majority of the design and research team members experienced a sustained and sustainable shift in power? Let me say that again. Have a majority of the design team members experienced a sustained and sustainable shift in power? That's the only question I ask. With the International Summer Service Learning Program, the answer was no. The way we ended the project, the power dynamics were exactly the same as they were at the beginning. No difference. In fact, this is what we experienced. This is a thing that I call a flip, where you're trying to do radical participatory design, and it flips to colonial participatory design, in which the nonprofit working with the school district said, "Ooh, we don't like what you've designed. We don't like that. So we're not going to do that." In other words, what they were saying is that you thought we had given up power, but actually we didn't. We just made it look like that. We always had the power, and we could always come back in like we're doing now and say no and change it. And so what we had to do is switch to a kind of futures methodology to treat the design that we created as a design future. And what could we design today that would be okay with them, but that would begin to lead us in the direction of that design future, which we estimated to be about 10 years away based on resistance and resources, et cetera. Instead, I want you to look at the Digital Literacy Project. And yes, it was a great project, and there was business design and org design and service design and UX design and all kinds of designs that were involved with the visual and the information architecture, et cetera. And we had hundreds of thousands in Bangladesh, and we had a bus program that went around with devices and internet access. And we had this internet sati program in tens of millions in India, where women were training women and giving devices and giving internet access. Wonderful. But the question is, what happened with this team? One person became a product manager. One person became a project manager. One person became a designer. Another person became an engineer, software developer. Another person was an instructional designer, and he received a promotion. Another person actually owned a small floral business selling flowers and did not want any of that. That was not a part of his vision for the good life. So he continued doing what he was doing. However, his business improved through the use of using internet technologies in ways that could help improve his business. I also invited 3 other people in order to diversify the group from my company. These were not designers or product managers or software engineers, et cetera, or data scientists. These were people from marketing and sales. There were 3 of them. All 3 of them quit their job within a year, and they knew they were going to do it by the end of this project. I quit my job within a year, and I knew I was going to do it by the end of this project. 100% of us experience a shift in power, either giving up power or assuming more power. I'll leave you with this forecast. Imagine a world in which the government decides to engage in radical participatory design. This ushers in a new future for the future of work, in which people from all walks of life come in through the government and learn new skills, some of them cycling out, taking those skills and getting new jobs, some of them staying in government with those skills. And one of these participatory design teams in government participatorily designs, policy design, a new law. And this planet-centered value creation law mandates that all for-profits, nonprofits, social enterprises, et cetera, must engage in participatory design, just like the government is doing. However, some companies, instead of engaging in radical participatory design, engage in colonial participatory design, still disempowering through the language and works of empowerment those people. Now, when we do forecast and futures design, or what I call futures, we often ask, is this a future that you prefer? Is this a future you like? Or is there a component of this future that you prefer? And if the answer is yes, what strategies would you take? What decisions would you make? What steps would you employ to increase the likelihood that that future or the components of the future that you like or prefer happen? I invite you today to begin to give up power where you hold it and practice radical participatory design, primarily in communities where you're already a member. Thank you.
I intentionally wanted to give a few minutes of silence there to just let that all land. Victor, that was astonishing. Thank you so much for sharing that. Wow. I'm going to invite everyone to, if they have questions, to drop them in the chat, and we'll go through them as they come up. But I want to get I want to get things started by asking you what I noticed in a lot of the examples you gave. They tended to be more community focused, right? Where you're out in the community doing community projects. Have you ever brought this radical participatory design into for-profit business that, you know, really is where most of us sit in our jobs? And, you know, have you, and if you have, can you talk about that experience and how we can translate this into something that might work more in our everyday life, in the design that a lot of us do in our everyday lives?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would say, and sorry, I have striped lines coming in through this window at me. The first thing I would say is to treat it as a process. I think a lot of us are in situations in which you may not be able to jump immediately from the design that you're practicing all the way to what I'm calling radical participatory design, which you could think of as an ideal. So my question would be to you, just what's one step that can get you closer and move you in that direction? So first of all, think of it like that. But two, I have been lucky enough to practice this in for-profit, nonprofit, public, academic sectors, kind of all throughout. In fact, the digital literacy project that I shared was from a for-profit company. One of the reasons I had funds to do many of the different ways of compensating. So that is an example. I'm also doing it right now for NASA, so from the public sector, and that can be a way in for you as service designers, because I know there are many different definitions of service design, so I'm not going to go through them all, but one of them, the most robust anyway for me, is that you're designing both the service but also the mechanisms behind the service in order to improve the customer experience and the employee experience, specifically because we know that a really great employee experience can improve the customer experience. And it actually works the other way as well. So one of the things I found is that when I'm working with an organization and they're scared or nervous or hesitant to do radical participatory design on the customer side, they're often more likely or more open to doing it on the employee side. So I have an employee, a participatory employee experience, how am I say, an employee participatory design team and a customer participatory design team. And that's all, I have a lot of things that I think of as tips or tricks, but that's one of them where you might start with that, let them see what it looks like, how it might work, if it has any successes, and they can begin to become open to the idea of beginning to do it with customers on the outside. I'm going to hit the blinds
That's
so that I keep showing you the light.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. That's a great idea to start on the employee side, where you've got a little more, I hesitate to use the word control, given the presentation you've just given, but where it's a little more within the sphere of your involvement, where you can have some impact. Mindy asked in the chat, what are the challenges that you run into with RPD?
Yeah, so there are tons of challenges, so I'm not even sure where to start. But I would say all the challenges that you normally find in a design process, you find. So communities are not homogeneous, number one. So you have to deal with community dynamics. I find it a challenge to create a qualitatively representative sample. So when I look at research or books or papers, I don't see a lot of people talk about how you do this. I do see a lot on quantitative representative samples for quantitative research, but I don't see it much on the qualitative side. So I try to create a qualitative, I look at every quality or characteristic of the community, of the people for whom we're designing, which if it changed, would change how I would design for them. And then we look for variance across those qualities. Usually the heuristic you might use is extremes, people on the extreme, people mainstream. So for instance, for this project, one of them was, we want people who are always the first people to adopt the newest technology. And we want people who are resistant and never adopt new technologies. And we want people who are kind of in the middle. And hopefully if we create something that works for the ends and the people in the middle, that it could work along that. So we have that across all the different characteristics. We do that across all the different characteristics. However, we also try to do intersectional research. So for sometimes the combinations are important, right? It's not just that I try to adopt the newest technology, but maybe it's different for me trying to adopt the newest technology as a woman than it is as a man in this particular country, this region, right? Or intersections of race, et cetera. So sometimes we have to look at specifically certain combinations, not just making sure we have all those things. So that idea is hard, but once you let go of the fact that you have to control, it's a little bit easier. You just recruit the community, and the community, once they join the team, then helps you recruit the community to get to that, as opposed to you having to have that all figured out. So there's some of that. There's the whole educational component. So I think it's very easy. I think one of the easiest ways that we colonize the knowledges or histories of people in design, or participatory design specifically, is through the choice of the methodology. So this is hard for designers. Like, oh, wait a minute, you mean I don't choose the methodology we're using, or and a lot. So because if you do participatory design and you choose it, then some of the stuff that I said, the benefits, you won't see. But if it's the community that's leading the way, then it's like, oh, I even had a Another challenge I think is sometimes communities don't know. And by the way, I'm not even speaking of the organizational challenges. I'm just talking about the challenges with communities. Sometimes communities don't know. They're like, Victor, I don't know. I'm not sure what we should do. I don't know any of this. Or Victor, I don't want to facilitate. I don't know how to facilitate. I've never done this before. So, you do things like where maybe the professional facilitators start out doing it, and then you kind of, by the middle point, it's a mix, and by the end, it's the community doing it all, until they get to a comfortable place. But oftentimes, if you have a diverse enough community, you will find that there are skills and assets in the community, and somebody does some facilitation in some form or manner. You just have to make sure you have that. If it's present in the community, you have it present on the team. But the same thing with the methodology, they might not know. So for that digital literacy project you saw, I took a toolkit. We used a toolkit. And the funny thing is, this is my estimation. I could be wrong, but what we created, I think, didn't come from almost anything that we did in that process. It was almost like the only thing that it came from was there was one of the parts of our process was positive deviance, which a lot of designers will treat as a method without realizing that positive deviance is an entire methodology. So positive deviance is like, hey, Cassie Berry, can you come? I have this situation where in this place, a lot of the children are malnourished and a lot of them end up dying earlier. So you come in as the experts and you're supposed to, do the research, see the problem, and say, okay, based on this problem, we recommend this type of nutrition, these vitamins, this whatever, and we can work out a way. We've designed a solution to bring that in, or from neighboring countries, whatever. And this is actually the first instance of positive deviance. But instead, this particular person, I think was from Save the Children, goes, okay, is there anybody here in the community that isn't malnourished? And they said, oh yeah, there's about, 2% of us. I don't know if you want to talk. Yeah, can I go talk? So they go and they do the research. They just observe. Then all of a sudden they're like, oh, when they cook let's say carrots, I can't remember what it was. The mothers, this is a place that didn't have a lot of variety of food, would take the greens and throw it into the stew as well, whereas most everyone else wasn't. This is one example. So what happens though in a positive deviance methodology is what you're saying is, wait a minute, I'm not bringing the knowledge and the solution. It's already there in the community, inherent. I'm just helping to elevate and propagate it out to everyone else. So it's its own whole methodology. So all I say is, when we did the digital literacy project, I'm pretty sure that I tend to do a lean process. So I don't create one prototype. I think visual designers still do this a lot more, but I feel like UX, UI, we don't do it as much. But I'll create multiple prototypes. We break up into teams and we test them all. And then we look at how do we merge it or combine them or choose the best one or pieces of. So we had 3 prototypes that we were testing, and all 3 of them came from things they found within the community during our research. It might have been slight tweaks, but they were pretty much positive deviance, which I was like, oh, so all that stuff we did didn't even matter, but it just like a natural occurrence that happened with the community. So there's a lot of stuff I could say. Even in participatory design, there's a romanticism or even a fetishization of the community perspective, as if they know everything and it's going to work. I'm not fetishizing it. Is that even? Yeah, I think I'm saying it right.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is that in a lot of cases, or many cases, or in all cases, it's the community's decision. So whether or not they make the right decision or not, it's more an issue of justice, right? Of their empowerment, they empowering themselves, etc., rather than, oh, this will bring the best design outcome. Although it does bring the best design outcome, I've found, when you do it. So those are some. I could say many more, and there's also organizational challenges. But hopefully that was helpful.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. There were a couple questions in the chat kind of around the idea of, in that business setting, getting your executive sponsors or, getting them on board, how you can affect shifts in power structures, right? To bring kind of a cultural buy-in to this sort of, to the RPD.
Yeah, you gotta, there's a number of things I can say. So I'll just say a few and then let me know if I answer it or if you want to talk more about it. But look for small projects. look for projects that are small enough that they're not super high profile that where they won't let you do it, but big enough that if you get a success, it means something. Or I've seen the case where maybe it might not be big enough where you get a success, but it means something, but you have a number of small projects that you link together to show a body of work, a portfolio to say, hey, this actually ends up showing more ownership and adoption by our people, et cetera. Use failed projects. That digital literacy one that you saw is an example. They gave up. They said, look, I don't care. Victor, do whatever you want. The moment they gave up power, then the community was able to assume it with the budget we had, and it was beautiful. Sometimes what you could do is do radical participatory design for a phase, for a section, for a part of the design process. Really, I think the easiest thing for community members is on the research side that feeds the design. So starting there, even if you don't take it all the way through design, as a first step, is a way to do that. I've done some things where I've invited stakeholders who have decision-making power into the process and they experience it themselves. That's very difficult because very few of them have time or have the care, would care enough to invest the time. But that also, the experience of it affects it. Sometimes what I've done is like, okay, look, you want to do this thing, and I feel like it may be in the wrong direction, and I think a radical participatory design process could help show that or not. So we just said, can we just do a quick, there's different terms for this, assumptions slam, assumptions mapping. So you map out the assumptions. You all may have seen this before, crucial, not crucial, known, unknown, whatever. And then you just look at the ones that fall in the quadrant of the most crucial assumptions that if they're wrong, this won't work. And unknown meaning we know the least about it. We're least sure whether or not our assumption is true or false. And you say, hey, could I take a week? Could I take however long you want to say to just test these out in a radical participatory way before and then if we find that we find the assumptions false, we would have saved this much money or this much time, which might be important to you, et cetera. So there are things like that I say. Another one that I see is this is a hard one. Let me see how to frame it. Why do we need designers in the world if we're doing radical participatory design? Then what's the point of having professional designers? So I try to use the cooking analogy, right? Everybody, I would like everyone to cook or to be able to prepare some food because you have to eat. And there are times where you're alone or you're with your friends or family. However, just because everyone cooks in their home doesn't mean a chef's job is obsolete. We use chefs for catering events. We use chefs for restaurants. Chefs create cookbooks. But by the way, chefs can learn something from people who never wrote a cookbook, like let's say Jamaican mothers who've been making really cool food. They didn't publish a cookbook, but some chefs go in, they learn that, and they try to publish a book. So there's knowledge there, right, of ways of making and cooking food that aren't necessarily taught in a particular school. But there's still room and spaces for chefs in our world, in our society. When you go out to a restaurant, you want to have an experience. Chefs are part of that. So all of those examples show that it doesn't become obsolete, but it just shows that, wait a minute, there actually is design expertise or knowledge or culinary expertise and knowledge in people that are not professional chefs or professional cooks or chefs, whatever word you would use. I know that they're different.
As a former chef, I appreciate that analogy quite a bit. That was good. Marja, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. She asked if we're newer to the design and design research fields like me, what are ways to get started in skill building with RPD?
So the skills that you would need to do RPD, you're newer to design and you want to kind of, that's interesting. I mean, I guess in some sense, what RPD is a type of, and this is something I'm working on now, relational design, right? So any skills that help with building relationships, I think would fit into that, which is communication, establishing trust, doing activities, building shared experiences, values, goals, which bond people together. Any of those types of things I think are quite helpful. I think when you think of relational work, doesn't have to necessarily be design. Like I'm a big practitioner of relationality. So when I do service, I like to do relational service as opposed to transactional service. When I do tourism, I like to do relational tourism. Um, I've done relational insurance. If any of you are in faith-based communities where you tithe or heard of tithing, I've done relational tithe, etc. So I kind of bring it into everything. And the thing about relationality is it takes the burden off of you. It's not about you. You don't have to have all the skills. That's why you have a community. The thing is to pull from all of the skills and assets and abilities of the community in order to do this together. And then through the process of working together, you learn and build skills. So it's really important that designers, we remember that I haven't talked about why all the different reasons why people do participatory design, but one of them is mutual learning. And I'm really glad that that's pretty well established that it's mutual. Yes, a community member or a person for whom we're designing might learn some research skills or might learn some design skills, but we are also learning. It's an embedded educational experience at every step of the way, if it's radical anyway, of their lived experience, their experiential knowledge, their lived knowledge, their cultural knowledge. All of that is coming to us as well and is really embedded throughout the process, which I love because I've actually done projects with professional designers that I respect where the further we get away from the research, when it's not continual research, it's like they lose connection to it. And I said, well, wait, where did that come from? I was like, oh, I think it was in there. And so we go back and we don't find it, or we find it, but it was only one person said it out of 100, which is still qualitatively a data point. And I've seen it even happen like a day after, a week after. And so I love this. When you do the radical participatory design, the community calls you out. They call us out. Wait. You know, it's like it's embedded in there. Anyway, I would say change the question. The burden is not on you. And I think the real skills you need are just relational, learning how to relate to people and communicate and have that knowledge going back and forth between you.
Let's see. Is it Megan? Megan, forgive me. Speak up if you'd like to correct me. Please feel free.
Megan, you got it.
Megan, okay. Megan is asking, well, Megan, go ahead and you're off mute. Go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you.
Everybody's tired of hearing me.
Yeah, I'm really interested in the aspect of trauma-informed work in design, especially within different organizational contexts. So I was really interested in that aspect of what you had to say. And I'm wondering if you can talk any more about sort of the approaches you take to that work with the community and sort of both a practical sense and then sort of a more strategic sense where you address those guiding principles from SAMHSA in the work.
Yeah, it's maybe some of it is formally addressed, but I think a lot of it is kind of informally addressed. So I think I've worked on a lot of professional design teams where we don't do any type of addressing of that. We don't do any type of addressing of bias, but we will do, at least on teams that I'm on, we do things like we do trauma awareness exercises, we do bias awareness exercises, we do journaling, and we don't do journaling as a one-time thing. Sometimes we might do it before every interaction when we go out to do some work. I'm talking about the design team or research team. Sometimes we might do it on a weekly basis. So we actually have practices where we think about that and we talk about that, we have conversations. But it's interesting, like I feel like if you look at some of these methodologies or toolkits, equity-centered design, liberatory design, etc., a lot of them look like just a normal design process, and they throw in intersperse it with reflexive activities just to kind of reflect. Yeah, I mean, that's helpful, but I think it doesn't go far enough because number one, I want to move beyond reflexivity to reflexibility. So where I'm reflecting, but I'm also, that's affecting my action. And sometimes you can reflect and know something, but you're not acting from what you know, you're acting instinctually, right? Really great book about this is My Grandmother's Hands, which talks about, and I've seen this as well, like, oh yeah, I do all this training with my team on hiring, and then we get in the middle of the hiring and someone's like, don't hire that person, you can't hire that person. I'm like, why? Because of this and that. I said, it's not in the rubric. Yeah, but you know, but if it was important, it should be in the rubric. So it's like there's an instinctual thing, and we have to actually do practices, and we try to do these centering practices, et cetera, and decentering practices as well, to decenter ways of thinking or people that are normally centered um, as we enter into process. So I don't see that in a lot of teams, but we do things like that. I don't know if that's helpful at all or not.
That is really helpful. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
There are a couple of questions looking backwards and looking forwards. What books and sources and frameworks have informed you and your design practice and this idea of RPD? And then what can you recommend, and maybe they're the same, for us to help sort of build these practices?
Yeah, it sounds, I don't know if it sounds egotistical or narcissistic, but I don't know that this is what I think happened. I think at one point I had this toolkit. So in 2007, the Gates Foundation pays IDEO.org a bunch of money to create a toolkit to use in international development, specifically global education, global health, because that's what Gates does. Now, I hope no one here works for IDEO, but IDEO, if you've seen work from them and then hired them, you will notice that they can be hit or miss. Oh wait, this is public. Well, that's fine. They can be hit or miss. So I think what I didn't understand is that sometimes people like IDEO, but it can be other people as well, can write things in toolkits that are aspirational, or that's the way they want to represent or present themselves, but it's not always the way they're doing it. So anyway, I had a toolkit, and I think it was their toolkit, where I read something at one part in the toolkit that said, oh, you should work alongside communities, you should go get communities. And when I look back at it, I think people didn't interpret it the way I interpreted it. So I don't know if it has to do with my background or where I come from, but when I read it, for some reason, the way I interpreted it meant, oh, the first thing I need to do is get people. Now, if you look at any participatory design toolkit, they all often will say, do step A, do step B, do step C, and then at D, bring in the people, because now you've prepped things and you frame things. And I've never done that. And I don't know if it's just how I interpreted the toolkit based on my lens, but I just like, oh yeah, I got to get people. So I get people, that's the first thing I do. And I didn't say this in the talk, but radical participatory design is a meta methodology. There's no, you do whatever you want to do, cross-sectional research, longitudinal, single subject, quantitative, qualitative, you lean startup, experimental, whatever you, I don't care. It's just do it radically participatory. So there's no methodology necessarily. It's just a way of doing a methodology. So in terms of books that I think that are quite inspiring in terms of some of this, I would say any book that it's about decolonizing, not design specifically, but participatory design. So notice, whenever I talk about this, I always want people to be troubled and walk away like with a heavy heart. But they're always like, yeah, yeah. And I'm like, wow, is everybody just doing this? How come no one feels like challenged? I'm not even challenging, I don't know what the right term is, traditional designers. I'm challenging the progressive ones who are doing participatory design. I'm saying you're not doing it enough. You're not going far enough. So it's not even about like, if you don't do it, okay, I'm talking to the ones who are trying to do it and I'm saying go further. So, Arturo Escobar, of course, Designs for the Pluriverse, great book. A little more academic and intellectual. And so some people have trouble like, well, how do I put it into practice? But I would say any of the books that deal with decolonizing. So from the research side, Decolonizing Research Methodologies by Linda Smith. She's from the Maori tribe. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. Indigenous group from New Zealand. Research is Ceremony, which has a really beautiful principle, a version of the Heisenberg principle. That principle that says like for subatomic particle, you can't know both the location and the speed. You know the speed, can't know the location. So in that book, Sean Wilson has this, I call it the indigenous Heisenberg principle. I'm not sure if he calls it that, but like you can't both define a context, define a concept and know the context at the same time. Either you know the concept, either you know a definition, but that definition then doesn't work in a specific context, or you define the context and it loses the definition. And I think that's some of what has happened when you talk about design or participatory design, we have this global definition, not understanding that design looks and operates in many different ways across the world, and even within our own country in different communities. I've seen it, you know, it's funny to me when I see it as a department in a university, because I'm like, well, wait a minute. I've seen design as an art, as a humanity, as a social science, as an applied and engineering science, as a basic and natural science. Why is it only here? Are you saying chemists don't design? Why is it only here? Are you saying historians don't design? Why are you, you know? So I see it in many different ways. The same thing is true with participatory design. I had one person, I sometimes write academic papers, and one reviewer said, fine, design is old because Manzini said it in the book, everyone designs, everybody designs, which you should look up as well. But he's like, but participatory design, no, it's not old. Participatory design must and requires there to be the present a professional designer. And I said, what? No way. I mean, not in my experience. Participatory design happens whether or not there's a professional designer there. It's just the participation of the community who's going to use it. Or the same dynamics that I see there, assuming the professional designer is not acting in colonial ways, are there when the professional designers. It's interesting how people look at things. But I would say some of those books are really good. I can any kind of decolonizing books I think are quite helpful, because this is radical participatory design is a way of decolonizing participatory design. Oh yeah,
Great,
yes,
thank you.
yes. Somebody talked about, that's a good book too, Emergent Strategy. One of the concepts in that is she uses a lot of biological concepts to demonstrate how we should be. And so one of them is, I can't remember what she calls the concept, but she's looking at a fern or fractals. So you look at a leaf of a fern, and then you look at a part of the fern leaf, and it has the same shape as the entire thing, and a part of that has the same shape as the entire thing, and it keeps going down. And the idea is to be the change that you want to see. So if I want to see change, if I'm trying to do design towards a just end, I need the process itself to be just. So yes, 100%, whoever wrote that, Megan, Emergent Strategy, it's a way of making the process be towards the solution, especially if you're doing a design justice project. The process has to be just as well.
Ruben asked if foundational understanding of intersectionality, is that a prerequisite for successful radical participatory design, in your opinion?
No, not necessarily. No, I think you should do intersectional research even if you're not doing participatory design. I think if you're just recruiting people, you're going to miss perspectives if there is an extra added effect of having two different qualities in the same person, right? So, and that's one of the things I'm looking at. I'm trying to work with and help and work alongside women-owned businesses and minority-owned businesses, but it's also very important to me to find minority women-owned businesses, because it might be slightly different than either of those two additive effects. So it's not related to participatory design, doing intersectional research. Even finding a qualitatively representative sample is not specific to participatory design. So no, it is not necessary, but I think you need it, period, in general. And I have found when I'm a part of a community, alongside a community, the community brings that in. More often they bring it in naturally without us having to formally kind of introduce it. Like, oh, we need to talk to these. Why? I thought we have this and this. No, it's different, you know.
That's great. We have just another minute. Probably have time for a question from the floor. If anybody just wants to come off mute and chime in, feel free.
I might jump in off the opportunity if the floor is quiet. I don't know. All this is like, the bar is so tremendously high, and you know, in a lot of the environments that I'm working in, it feels almost prohibitive. So I would be curious about how you might, what advice you might have in terms of helping build more intellectual humility and curiosity in the teams that we work in.
Yeah, there's people that have really cool tools like Leslie Ann Noel. You all might know her. She has the designer's critical alphabet. I might be mispronouncing it, which is really cool. It's a bunch of cards and it has these different topics. But she also, I'm trying to think of who first created it. I know she uses it, but I'm not sure if it's from her. But there's this positionality wheel, which is really cool. It's something that groups can do at the very beginning of a process to see, oh, what positions, social positions, are missing from our design team. So these are more reflexive, right? And so I think I have seen where people do these reflexive processes, and then it stops. It doesn't then take it to the point of actually. But I think to build awareness is the first step, and then you have to make the connection between awareness and action. So there are a bunch of those type of reflexive type of activities. I mean, there's all kinds of, I often say, how do I say it? Design thinking is just doing or thinking, doing, acting like a designer. This is not everyone's definition, this is just me. And human-centered design is only one way of doing that. There are many ways. So like I mentioned already, society-centered, life-centered, planet-centered. But there's a bunch of, some of these toolkits that are emerging, like value-sensitive design is a really great one. And even if you don't use all the things, just taking one method, one activity to kind of bring that in. There are some people who are working on things like life-centered or planet-centered activities. I don't think I've ever seen an entire toolkit, but you can find some blog posts here and there. How do you create a persona for a non-human and things like that? So there's a number of different things. But yeah, I would say start with awareness-based activities and putting them into the process, which you can pull from the equity-centered design toolkit or the liberatory design toolkit.
Well, Victor, thank you so much. This has been, I think I can hopefully speak for everybody, this has been enlightening and engaging, and it was a truly fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. I will end with just the question, are you hiring? Because I'd like to come work for you. Because I think there's a lot we can all learn from you. So thank you for sharing your knowledge and your perspective. Really appreciate it. To our audience, thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed it. And we'll see you the next time.